She said 7 words at my Christmas table that changed everything. She looked across the dinner plates, past the candles my late daughter used to light every year, past the boy who had been living in my house for 3 years and calling me Grandpa since he was 8 years old, and she said, loud enough for him to hear, "He's not really one of us." 7 words. My grandson's name is Marcus. He was 11 years old that Christmas. He had his mother's eyes, my daughter's eyes, and he had been through more in his short life than most adults I've ever known. And in that moment, he looked down at his plate and went completely still. I spent 30 years on the family court bench. I have seen what cruelty does to children. I know what it looks like when a child decides, in one quiet moment, that they don't belong. I was not going to let that happen at my table. My name is Raymond. I'm 64 years old. I was a family court judge in a mid-sized city in the Midwest for 3 decades before I retired. I saw, conservatively, more than 4,000 cases during that time. I decided who got to keep their children. I decided who didn't. I decided what family looks like under the law. And more importantly, what it looks like in practice, when the paperwork is gone and all that's left is a parent and a child and whether or not love shows up. I retired 4 years ago. My wife, Gloria, had passed 18 months before that. Breast cancer. Quick. In the end. Which was a mercy. But not quick enough that I didn't have time to understand exactly how large a space she occupied in my life. We had 1 daughter, Sarah. Sarah was everything Gloria and I had ever hoped for. She was kind and funny, and she had a way of making a room feel warmer just by walking into it. She married a good man, a contractor named Derek, and they had Marcus when Sarah was 28. Marcus was, from the very first moment I held him, the kind of child who looks at you like you're the most interesting thing he's ever seen. He was 8 years old when Sarah died. A car accident? Winter roads. It was quick. There was no warning. No goodbye. One morning she was there and that evening she was not. And the world rearranged itself in a way I am still, 4 years later, learning to navigate. Derek was devastated. We were. But Derek's grief did something to him that I don't fully blame him, for it collapsed him. He couldn't work. He couldn't cope. He couldn't look at Marcus without seeing Sarah. And eventually, in a conversation that I will never forget as long as I live, he sat across from me in my kitchen and asked me to take the boy. Not permanently, he said. Just for a while. Just until he got back on his feet. I said yes without hesitation. 18 months later, I filed for legal guardianship. Derek didn't contest it. 6 months after that, when it became clear that Derek had moved across the country and started a new life that did not include room for an 8-year-old boy, I filed for adoption. The adoption was finalized on a Tuesday afternoon in the same courthouse where I had worked for 30 years. The clerk who processed the paperwork had known me for 2 decades. She cried. I didn't. I had made my peace with it. Marcus was my son. In every way that mattered. The paperwork was just the law catching up to a fact that was already true. Marcus called me Grandpa. He'd always called me that. And I saw no reason to change it. We settled into a life together. I cooked badly. He didn't complain. He went to school, made friends, joined the robotics club. He had Sarah's talent for fixing things and my stubbornness about finishing what he started. We watched football on Sundays. We argued about video games. I helped him with homework and pretended I didn't know how to do the math so he'd feel smart when he figured it out. It was, against all odds, a good life. My son, Thomas, Sarah's older brother, lived 20 minutes away with his wife. Diane. Thomas and I had always been close. The way fathers and sons can be when they put in the work. We had dinner together every few weeks. He came to Marcus's school events. He was, by any measure, a good uncle. Diane was a different story. I want to be fair about this, because fairness matters to me. Diane wasn't cruel in an obvious way. She wasn't loud about it. She was the kind of person whose cruelty operated at a low temperature, a constant, ambient cold that you only notice when you realize you've been standing in it for too long. The first thing I noticed was the gifts. The first Christmas after Marcus came to live with me, Diane gave him a gift. It was a small thing, a book. I think. Nothing wrong with it, but Thomas's children. My two biological grandchildren, Emma and Jake, had received elaborate presents, a gaming setup, jewelry, gift cards with triple-digit values. And Marcus got a book. I told myself it was the first year. Adjustments take time. The second Christmas, same pattern. Emma and Jake got bicycles. Marcus got a puzzle. I mentioned it to Thomas. He looked uncomfortable. He said Diane meant well. He said she was still figuring out the family dynamics. He said give it time. I gave it time. The third thing, and this one I didn't learn about until much later, was what Diane said to Marcus directly. Not in front of me. In the kitchen. Or the hallway. Or in those small in-between moments when adults think children aren't listening and children are always listening. Marcus told me about it months later. Matter-of-factly. The way children sometimes report terrible things as if they're weather reports. He said Aunt Diane sometimes called him the extra one. He said she'd told him once that the family photos were kind of complicated now. He said she'd told him that adoption wasn't really the same as being blood, and that he should understand that some family things were just for the real grandkids. He said it without tears. That almost broke me more than tears would have. I am a man who has spent his career dealing in facts. I do not make decisions based on anger alone. I filed the information away. I watched. I waited. I gave Thomas more opportunities to correct things than I perhaps should have. And then came Christmas of last year. We were all together at my house, Thomas and Diane, Emma and Jake, Marcus and me. I had cooked, badly as always, and Marcus had helped. And the table was set with the same cloth Gloria had used every year for 30 years. I looked at that table and I thought, for just a moment, that Sarah would have loved this. Even imperfect, even complicated. She would have loved that her boy was here, with family. At Christmas, we were mid-meal when it happened. Emma, who is 16 and not a malicious child, made a comment about a family trip. They were planning something about spring break. Some resort in Florida. She started talking about who would be in which room, which cousins would bunk together, which grandparent would get the suite. And Diane said, without looking up from her plate, well, it's a family trip. So, and then she paused. Just long enough to make the pause mean something. And she glanced at Marcus. And she said he's not really one of us. The table went quiet. Marcus went still in the way I had seen him go still before. The way he'd gone still when I told him about his mother. The way he'd gone still when Derek called on his birthday and then didn't call again for 4 months. Thomas looked at his plate. Emma looked at her fork. And I set down my knife. I want to be honest with you about something. In 30 years on the family court bench, I have seen parents do things to children that would make your blood run cold. I have seen cruelty that was calculated, persistent, and documented across hundreds of pages of testimony I have sent people to jail. I have terminated parental rights. I have looked adults in the eye and told them, in plain language, that they were no longer permitted to be in the presence of the children they had harmed. Nothing in any of those cases made me feel what I felt in that moment. Because Marcus was not a case. He was my boy. He had his mother's eyes. And he was sitting at my table. And someone had just told him, in front of everyone, that he didn't belong there. I looked at Diane. I did not raise my voice. I said, Diane, I'd like you to think very carefully about what you just said. She looked up. There was a flicker of something in her face, not guilt. Not yet. But the beginning of a recognition that something had shifted in the room. She said, I just meant I said I know what you meant. I've known what you've meant for 3 years. Thomas started to speak. I held up one hand. And he stopped. Thomas has known me long enough to know that when I hold up that hand, I am not finished. I said, Marcus, would you please go upstairs for a few minutes? I'll call you when the table is cleared. Marcus looked at me. He was 11 years old and he was trying very hard to look like nothing had happened. He nodded once and pushed back his chair and walked upstairs without a word. That boy has more dignity than most adults I have ever met. When I heard his bedroom door close, I looked back at Diane. I said, I'm going to tell you a few things. I'd like you to listen. And I did. I told her that I had spent 30 years in a family court. I told her that I had seen what it looks like when a child is made to feel like they are less than less wanted, less valuable, less real than the children around them. I told her that I had seen, in clinical and legal detail, the long-term damage that kind of messaging does to a developing child's sense of self and belonging. I told her that I had signed the adoption papers for Marcus in the same courthouse where I had terminated other people's parental rights for doing less damage than she had done in 3 years of slow, deliberate exclusion. She started to object. She said she hadn't done anything, that she'd always been civil, that I was overreacting. I said, Diane, I have a file. She blinked. I said, I've been keeping notes, dates, incidents, exact language when I could confirm it. I have Marcus's account of the things you've said to him when you believed no one was listening. I have photographs from family events where Marcus was positioned outside the group or absent from the frame. I have the gift records for the last 3 Christmases. Item is it. Thomas made a sound. I didn't look at him. I said, I'm not telling you this because I intend to use it in a legal proceeding. I'm telling you this so that you understand the precise nature of what you have been doing, and so that you cannot tell yourself, or Thomas, or anyone else, that this was inadvertent. It was not inadvertent. You have been systematically and deliberately making an 11-year-old boy feel like he does not belong in his own family. And that ends tonight. Diane's face had gone through several colors by this point. She looked at Thomas. Thomas did not look back at her. That was the first surprise of the evening. I had expected Thomas to defend her, or at least to smooth things over the way he had been doing for years. But something had happened to Thomas in the last 60 seconds. He was looking at the tablecloth. His jaw was tight. He was doing the math on everything he had chosen not to see. Diane said, quietly, You can't just. This is a family dinner. I said it is. And Marcus is family. Let me be very clear about what I mean when I say that. He is not family in a we're generous enough to include him sense. He is not family in a we acknowledge he lives here sense. He is my son. In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of every person at this table, his mother was my daughter. His name is Marcus Wallace. And Wallace is my name. And he has the same legal standing in this family as Emma and Jake, and the same moral standing in this family as anyone who has ever sat at this table. If you cannot accept that fully, consistently, and without qualifications, then I think we need to have a different conversation about what holidays look like going forward. The table was silent. Emma had started crying. She was 16 and she wasn't a bad kid. And I think she had understood, maybe for the first time, that she had been a participant in something she didn't fully recognize until now. Thomas put his fork down. He said Diane. Just her name. But the way he said it, she looked at him. He looked back, and something passed between them that I was not a part of, but that I had seen many times in my career, a reckoning. The moment when one person in a marriage realizes that the other has been watching them, and seeing them clearly, and choosing, until now, not to say so. Thomas said, "We should go get Marcus." Diane started to speak. Thomas said, "Not you. Dad and I. We should go get Marcus." He pushed his chair back and stood up and waited. I looked at him for a moment, this son I had raised. This man with his mother's patience and his father's stubbornness, and I nodded once. We went upstairs together. Marcus was sitting on his bed with his headphones in, not playing anything, just sitting. He pulled the headphones out when we came in and looked at us with that careful, measured expression he'd been perfecting since he was 8 years old. Thomas sat down next to him on the bed. He said, "Marcus, I owe you an apology." Marcus looked at him. Thomas said, "I've been seeing things that weren't right for a long time, and I didn't say enough. That's on me, not on you. You are absolutely, completely part of this family. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that out loud." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay. Just okay." Like he was filing it away. Like he'd been hoping to hear it for a while, and now that it was here, he didn't need to make a big deal of it. Thomas put his arm around him. "Marcus, let him." I stood in the doorway and watched my son and my grandson sit together in the quiet. And I thought about Gloria, and about Sarah, and about all the forms that love takes when you least expect it, and all the work it requires to protect it from the people who mistake gentleness for weakness. We came back downstairs. Diane was still sitting at the table. Emma had moved to sit next to her mother's empty chair, which I thought said something about the evening. Thomas sat down. He said to Diane, "We're going to have a real conversation when we get home. Tonight, I'd like you to apologize to Marcus." Diane looked at Marcus. She said, stiffly, "I'm sorry if what I said was hurtful." There it was, the if. The conditional apology, the kind that protects the person giving it. Marcus, who is 11 years old and understands more than he is given credit for, said, "It's okay." He said it the way children say it when they mean it isn't. Quite. But they're willing to move forward anyway. That kind of grace in a child is something I have never stopped being amazed by. Dinner resumed. It was quieter than it had been. Emma helped clear plates. Marcus ate 2 pieces of pie and asked me if we could watch football later. Just us. And I said yes. But that wasn't quite the end of it. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and I talked more than we had in years. He told me things he'd noticed and not acted on. He told me about conversations Diane had with her own family, where she'd referred to Marcus in ways that were, at best, dismissive. He told me he'd been in a marriage where he'd been making excuses for behavior he knew was wrong, and that the Christmas dinner had been the thing that finally made him stop. Thomas and Diane went into counseling. I don't know everything that was said in those sessions, and I don't need to. What I do know is that Thomas, to his credit, drew a clear line. Marcus was not negotiable. The terms of their family, going forward, included Marcus, fully and without qualification. Or they didn't include them at all. That, I thought, was the son I raised. Something else happened in January. About 3 weeks after Christmas, Diane called me. I'll be honest, I was surprised. She is not a woman who apologizes easily. I suspected the counselor had something to do with it. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said at Christmas." I said I was listening. She said I didn't realize, I think I told myself I was just being realistic about family, about how these things work. But I heard what you said about what it does to children, and I've been thinking about Marcus. She was quiet for a moment. She said I was adopted when I was 5. And my cousins, my biological cousins, used to say things like that to me when I was young. And I spent a long time pretending it didn't matter. I was quiet too. She said I don't know why I did the same thing to him. I really don't. I think I'm going to have to figure that out. I said, that's a good place to start. That phone call changed the texture of things somewhat. Not entirely. Not immediately. But somewhat. By Easter, Marcus attended the Florida trip. He shared a room with Jake. They came back sunburned and arguing about who had the better swim time. And Marcus told me about it for 45 minutes over grilled cheese sandwiches. And his face looked the way it used to look before Christmas of the year before. Before 3 years of ambient cold had started to make him careful about where he stood. He looked like he belonged there. Because he did. He always did. I want to say something. For anyone listening to this who might be in Marcus's position who was told, or is being told, that they are an extra, a charity case, a guest in their own family. I want to say it clearly. Because I said it with 30 years of courtroom experience behind me, and I will say it again with everything I have left. The law does not care about your blood type. The law cares about your paperwork, your presence, and your name. But more than the law, and I say this as a man who spent a career trusting the law to protect people, what matters most is not who you came from. It is who shows up for you. It is who sits next to you on a hospital bed. It is who lights the candles at Christmas. It is who goes upstairs and finds you with your headphones in and sits down beside you and says, "You are part of this family." Fully. Without reservation. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. Marcus is 12 now. He placed second in a regional robotics competition last month. He called me from the auditorium while his team was still cheering. Just to tell me. I could barely hear him over the noise. I heard him fine. If you've been in Marcus's position, if someone made you feel like the extra one, or the charity case, or the guest who stayed too long, I hope you find your person. I hope you find the one who goes upstairs. And if you're listening and you have a Diane in your life, someone making a child feel like they are less than, I hope you find the courage to do what Thomas did. To stop excusing it. To say, finally, the thing that needed to be said. It is not too late. It almost always is not too late. But you have to say it. If stories like this one reach you somewhere real, consider subscribing. We tell these stories so that the people who lived versions of them know they are not alone. Marcus asked me last week if we could do Christmas at our house again this year. I said yes before he finished asking. He grinned his mother's grin, the one that takes up his whole face, and he went back to his robotics kit. And I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of my house and felt, more clearly than I have in a long time, that the right people are in the right places. It took some doing. It was worth every bit of it.